Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on your lunch. So Forrest and Kelsey are going to take you through some of the finer points of considerations regarding virtual work and having employees work from home. I wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk to you about some of the philosophy behind a working from home design, both in terms of the context from COVID-19 and what we've had to deal with since March and on a go forward. So if we want to think about it, when sort of March 13th happened, it caused all of us to immediately go to a working from home arrangement. And where I'm distinguishing the two is we literally picked up our papers and went to try to do whatever we do at the office from home. We were really trying to replicate the office experience as much as possible from a home environment. And that's not a bad thing. But a lot of that had to do with the temporary nature, or what we perceive to be the temporary nature. Obviously now it's October, we're realizing it wasn't temporary, it wasn't a 2-week problem. And a lot of us have shifted from this idea of trying to replicate what it is we were doing from home, like as if we were still in the office, to really moving towards a virtual work environment, really focusing on what is it we do, and how do we need to do it versus where are we doing it from. So it's a real shift to focus on the what the work is versus where the work is from. And it's not just replicating everything that we would do in the office from the office perspective, but really that shift towards like what is it we need to achieve and what's the most effective way to do that. So it very much is a paradigm shift. And so yeah, pre-2020, the idea of working from home was just, grab your laptop, grab your phone and answer a few emails. Where because of the pandemic, we're really focusing on a vital and interactive way of engaging with the workplace from anywhere in the world. And we're calling it from home, but really it's virtual work. This idea of we do not need a physical office to be effective in our jobs and in our workplace. Obviously, this isn't true for every single role. So the eligibility and the focus on who can work from home and who can't work from home should really be focused on who has a component of their job or a large component of their job that is truly based on physical location. So for example, if you're a server in a restaurant, it's a physical location. The idea of a virtual work environment is incredibly challenging and not possible in 2020. And so it's really this transition from like the pre-COVID state to immediately when it happened, we tried to pull everybody from home. And now we're kind of in a longer term COVID state and moving towards eventually a post-COVID state of who is it that should be able to work from home. And the answer to that question is actually a lot broader than you think. This paradigm shift of focusing on what the work is versus where the work is done from really becomes a competitive advantage. It's already been shown to have a dramatic effect of decreasing absenteeism, increasing engagement, increasing mental health and well-being, and reducing employer costs. On top of that, it's also an attention and attraction benefit. So the more competitive your culture is, the less competitive your salary needs to be. So that's another way to save money. It's hugely cost savings in terms of real estate and infrastructure. If you're able to look at what is it that we need to achieve and focus on tools to achieve the work versus locations to achieve the work. And employees have been in environments that are truly doing a virtual work model, they've actually been shown to be far more effective than employees in the workplace. That ability to structure work in a way that allows them to meet conflicting demands from life as well as work versus a traditional schedule of 8:30 to 4:30 in a certain location. So all of these things are sort of the underpinning as to why it's very advantageous to consider virtual work environments, not just from pandemic protection, which is obviously the immediate concern, but also on a go forward post-pandemic. How can we entrench certain behaviors, certain practices within our company to maximize the advantages of working from home? And with that, I will turn it over to Forrest. Yeah. I will take questions if there are any right now, but I think it might be better to hear a bit more detail from the other two, but I leave that to the audience.
And just on that notes, folks, if If you have a question you'd like to ask and you haven't used the Zoom webinar feature before, there's a little Q&A button right beside the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you click that and throw a question in for us to answer, feel free to do it as we speak, and we'll return back to it as we get to the end of each of our sections, so we can address those questions directly, and then we'll have a broader opportunity right at the end of the presentation just to do a free-for-all and ask questions regardless of the section that we're speaking to. So just an FYI on that, folks, front, everybody. Okay, well, I'm excited to be talking to you about compliance today. Yeah, we could jump right to the next slide and get into the nitty-gritties of it. So part of the considerations behind working from home, of course, is what are your legal obligations to your employees now that they've transitioned to a more virtual workplace. We all were pretty aware of what we had to do in a physical office location from a health and safety perspective and in a variety of different areas, but what does this new normal indicate? And I actually wanted to start in that conversation about compliance with first your responsibilities to accommodate employees who want to work virtually. I know many of us have made that transition to virtual work, particularly in more professional services related to industries, but there are still some of us who are trying to balance an in-person office and some employees working remotely. So part of the goal of what I want to speak to you today is not just touching upon the COVID scenario, but what you might need to deal with post-COVID. And part of why you working from home should be provided to employees is that sometimes it's not safe for employees to work on site. COVID is an obvious example of this, and there's a variety of different regulations that the government has in terms of how you need to manage your workspace. And if you are having employees working within your office, they need to be able to operate, 2 meters apart. There has to be the right air circulation throughout the building, an expectation of cleanliness, and ensuring that employees are aware of what they need to do to maintain the cleanliness of that work environment. But even in a pre or, hopefully one day post-COVID world, there still will be cases where it's unsafe to ask an employee to come into work. Situations like extreme weather, which we never have in this town. Health and safety issues might be caused by the building. If you have asbestos in the building that you're dealing with, construction work that's going on. I could tell you a horror story of an employee who actually had a concussion because somebody doing electrical work over their workstation. Or ultimately something as benign as an employee being asked to work alone in a downtown office that's near a high crime area, and they're working at night. So these are all factors that can impact the health and safety of an employee, and they might have a right to refuse working if you're not taking working in the office environment if you're not taking into account measures to protect them and to maintain their health and safety. And it might ultimately just be simpler to allow them to work virtually, particularly as we deal with COVID. And that's one of the messages we really want to hammer home, which is right now with COVID, our standards for having employees working remotely should be a bit more empathetic because of not just the health and safety risks that COVID poses to employees who come into a physical location, but the fact that those risks fluctuate as cases increase or decrease within the city, and that the ripple effect of COVID in our economy means that also employees are juggling things like childcare and taking care of family members, or that employee may themselves either be have autoimmune issues or things that make them in a high risk category, or have family members who are high risk as well. So we just advise generally, the standards that you set for employees in COVID time be a little less strict than what you would have applied pre-COVID when permitting people to work remotely. One of the factors, if sorry, Leanne, I've just paused dramatically for effect there. One of the factors to consider when you're having an employee work in the office because of COVID is it's not enough just to do what is required of you. It's also important to really zero in on the communication piece and make sure employees are aware of the steps you've taken to keep them safe. And just to finish off on this point, one thing to consider when you have an employee when you have an employee who's looking to work from home because of COVID, is to consider why exactly they're looking to get that permission to work remotely. They have access to something called an infectious disease emergency leave, which the Ontario government has put into place at the start of this crisis. And this is for employees who are being asked to isolate for COVID-19 related reasons, are taking care of themselves or a family member due to suffering from COVID, or for some other reason have direct care of another family member that prevents them from going into the office related to COVID, and that can often be childcare. Consider why the employee wants to work remotely. If they want to work remotely because of general concerns over COVID, totally appropriate step. If they want to work remotely because they need to care for a sick family member, and it might be too onerous to ask them to also balance their work, and instead having them go onto this leave, and of course allowing them to use paid sick leave if it's available, it may be a more empathetic response that allows them to focus on that immediate priority instead of trying to juggle working remotely and caring for a family member. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the legislative requirements that come into place when you're working remotely, and how that's different from what you deal with in the office. HR loves acronyms, so the two acronyms you see up there is the Employment Standards Act and the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and those are the two Ontario pieces of legislation that really govern our approaches to health and safety within the virtual workplace. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the employer's responsibility for the workplace is pretty murky. And in fact, the onus is more squarely put on the employee. And I'll give you a little bit of quick quotes from the legislation to outline that. So the Act defines a workplace as any land, premises, location, or thing at, upon, in, or near which a worker works, which is pretty much as broad as you can get. However, within that same clause, they put a little qualifier there and indicate that this Act does not apply to work performed in a variety of areas, but for our purposes, specifically in or about a private residence. So for that reason, the best practice from working remotely up until this point has been that the employee has responsibility for the health and safety of their workplace. However, it's a bit of a Wild West situation. We're going from a period where it was a unique perk for people working remotely and starting to become a growing trend, to now a reality for many employers and employees within the province. So it's best to be proactive in how you approach health and safety within your company. One of the things that you can do that to make that clear is to have a policy in place for what your expectations are for a safe work environment within the employee's home. That should include things like having a clear area within the house designated as their workspace. I know not all employees will have access to a separate room, but even if they're in a one-bedroom apartment, the expectation shouldn't be that the entire apartment is their workplace. There needs to be a targeted area that they're keeping clean and safe. They're removing any obstructions from. They're making sure they have all the appropriate equipment that they need to do their job within that environment. And then once you've communicated that policy, ensure that employees sign a form that you provide to them that outlines any hazards, where they can check if there's any hazards for the workplace, and then sign the form indicating that they've done this review and that their workplace is safe, and have them return that to you at least twice a year. So you have that on file, that you not only communicated with them of what your expectations are, but you followed up with it as well. And finally, if an employee is injured while conducting their work at home, you're going to want them to still contact the manager responsible for health and safety in a similar manner to which you would if they suffered that injury within the workplace. Jumping to the Employment Standards Act, a key component of the Employment Standards Act that I think we've all run into at one point or another, and it's a common headache for HR, is hours of work and overtime. And those two standards don't go away simply because the employee is no longer in your immediate line of sight. If your employee falls within the category of employees who need to have a set hours of time and need to be provided with overtime if they go over those hours of time, it's important that you continue to monitor those areas. So again, it's all about communication, making sure employees know what the policies are on those two areas, that they know how many hours of work they're expected to do in a week. And then it's about regular check-ins. So with hours of work, when you're having your one-on-one with your direct reports, see how they're doing in terms of their average hours in a week. If they're going a little, if you're expecting to work 40 hours and they're doing a lot of 44 hours or slightly longer weeks, see what check in with them about what they can do to balance their schedule. Is there anything that you can take off their plate, or any advice you can provide them to be a little bit more streamlined in how they approach their work? From an overtime perspective, you want to make sure that in your policy and how you communicate the policy, it's very clear that overtime only comes into effect if it's pre-approved by a manager. And then you're going to want to have your employees track their time if they are doing overtime. So it doesn't have to be onerous. You don't need to break out an Excel spreadsheet, but just a simple email updating, the amount of hours that they ended up working in that week after it's been approved, how that matches up with what's been approved and what that time was spent on. And you're going to want to make sure that your managers are reviewing that and approving it before sending it on to payroll. And one thing just to consider here is, when it comes to both hours of work and overtime, to be sympathetic to employees, and to communicate, to speak to them if you think it's going overboard, instead of jumping to the worst conclusions, because we may not. There's that expectation that if you're not directly seeing that work, they may not be properly doing it. But these are tough times, not just in terms of the logistics, like the mental health issues that we're all actively discussing, but also just from a logistical standpoint. There are things that are going to take more time now because they don't have that immediate access to colleagues to look through. They might be using a home computer instead of a company computer, and there's all kinds of confusions that can come from that. Just wrapping up in this area, from a first aid perspective, again, your expectations are different than they would have been within your workplace. You don't need to make sure that every employee is certified in CPR, but what you do want to do is make sure that employees have the equipment they need to respond to an emergency within their home. So as part of that check-in sheet, you will want to have employees confirm that they have a first aid kit on their premises. And that is also something that you might consider as a good faith gesture to provide for all employees, and also to ensure that that first aid kit is exclusively for the use of the employee and not their general other occupants of the household. And then also have employees consider, what are they going to do in the case of an emergency? Do they have a clear plan of how to get to the hospital? If they're living alone, which particularly many of our younger workforces are facing right now, if they're living alone, do they have a neighbor or family member who can check in on them, once a day or several times in a week? And if they don't, then you're going to want to make sure your managers, as through the normal procedures of the day, are just checking in and making sure everybody's okay and copacetic, and there no accidents have taken place. And a final thing to just keep in mind with this component is that while the health and safety expectations of your workplace don't apply within a singular home office, once employees come together, and this is going to become more pertinent post-COVID, once employees come together at a company premises, suddenly those old rules snap back into place. We call this the Christmas party rule in HR. So if you're having on-site training, if you're organizing a conference, if you have a team meeting in person, or if it's just a social gathering at the office, your expectations for health and safety for a larger workplace comes back into the forefront. So jumping to some other risks to consider that aren't directly related to legislation, information security is a big one. For many employees are dealing with confidential information that either needs to be kept confidential for legislative reasons or for contractual obligations to your clients. Consider the home office similar to you would the work office. If there are files that, if they were in the office, they would be needing to put away in a locked storage container, which is a weird way of saying file cabinet. But if you had a file that they would need to keep contained in a file cabinet that's locked and secure, then if they have physical files at home, same expectation there. If there are files the virtual files they have access to that you need to keep confidential. Consider VPNs or other tools that can allow you to maintain those files on servers you control. And this isn't just a consideration of, other family members that employees might have that are in that space and needing to keep that information separate. It's also a consideration of burglaries or any other factors that might negatively impact the security of those files. And then, of course, we have substance use. If an employee is cracking open a beer or smoking a joint in their day-to-day practices of work in the office, everybody would notice that very quickly, and you could jump on that pretty damn quick. If you've got an employee instead who's at their home, you don't have that same visibility, and there's not a lot of value in trying to recreate that, because quite frankly, you can't unless you get everybody on a Zoom call 8 hours a day. Instead, what you want to be policing is impairment. You want to maintain a zero tolerance for impairment while employees are working. And this isn't just a health and safety consideration for the employee. It's also, of course, a performance consideration for the work that they're doing. And if you see any strange behavior by email, during a call or a team meeting, you want to respond to that impairment in the same way if you were to see them impaired within the office, including making very clear that there will be disciplinary consequences for impairment and following through, with the exception, of course, of if the impairment is as a result of an addiction, which you then need to deal with a little bit more carefully because of protected ground. So in that case, you want to get them into counseling. But generally speaking, we're not policing the use of substances because it's very difficult for us to do so. We're instead policing impairment while working from home. So we'll wrap up this component of the presentation by just walking through some of the key goals of managing remote workers. Ultimately, you're managing the work being done, not the place in which it occurs. And so part of what that looks like from a performance management perspective is making sure that you are having your managers regularly check in with their direct reports. One-on-ones every other week or every week were good practice pre-COVID. They've become essential now that we have that distance. You don't have the ability to, just connect quickly at the end of the day with your employees or to, see what they're doing at lunch. You need to be actively going out of your way to maintaining those connections and those check-ins. When it comes to project work and trying to see where employees are on that project, you no longer have the asset of being able to casually check in at their desk or, as I say, just kind of poking in and out. Some of the chat features like Slack or Teams are useful conduits to this, but another way to make sure that you're keeping on top of what your employees are doing and you have that visibility is by one, checking in with them on those weekly one-on-ones, but also setting clear markers in terms of deadlines, the expected performance indicators where, when they finish this aspect of the project, they're going to check in with you, and using that as an opportunity for to making sure that you're keeping a track of where the project is as it rolls out. And then we get into the team building component that used to just be a natural byproduct of being in, an office space with 20 or more people. Now we kind of have to go out and engineer that a bit more. When you're looking at social events, my general belief is that unique and irregular beats repetitive but regular events. I don't know how true this is for other people on the call, but for many of us, if we would have these Friday beers or things of that nature, like this opportunity just to decompress and reconnect with folks. And those started to fall out very quickly because in COVID, there's not a lot to update. There's not a lot of fun weekend plans, and they feel like kind of just repetitive requirements of the work instead of a real opportunity to bond. Consider doing fun things like a virtual tour of a zoo, a virtual escape room, party games that you can do by phone. There's some applications that allow you to watch Netflix movies, and schedule those for like once a month, but make them something fun and engaging that people can talk about and feel separate from their general work as a way to keep everybody connected and engaged. And final point I just want to run through before we jump off. Vacation is there to be taken. not just to go to exotic locations. It's there for people to decompress, to get away from work, and to avoid burnout. If your employees aren't taking their vacation because they're thinking, gosh, I want to go somewhere fun after COVID, it's a fair goal, but more important is to get your employees to take that time off, to take a step away from the computer and just avoid the burnout that is so much easier to get to in these particularly stressful times. All right, that's it for me. Are there any questions that folks would like to jump into? I see. Sorry, go ahead, Leanne.
I was going to say there is one in the Q&A about masks that I think would be great to address.
Yeah, so I see. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, what would you suggest HR can do if your senior managers and leadership team refuse to follow mask wearing and sanitation procedures due to COVID fatigue? So this is a really tough one. Part of the advantages you have on your side is you can make a legal compliance case. So all employees now in Ontario, sorry, I should take that back. All employers in Ontario are required to have their employees do symptoms testing prior to coming in, and that's a quick little website that you can hit, and just goes through, do you have any of the symptoms? If you say no, then you're clear to return to work. And they need to, you need to have your employees do that, and then submit that they've successfully passed before coming into the workplace. So that it can help you if people are kind of being flagrantly avoiding the symptoms component of social distancing. But the other reality from that legal compliance standpoint is if you have employees who are refusing to wear masks or sanitize, they are actually creating an unsafe workspace, and you can come at it from that perspective. The other thing to touch upon is what would the public reaction be to that business if somebody gets sick from COVID and it becomes known that the CEO of the organization was refusing to wear a mask or to properly sanitize. And they may not think that information is going to go out, but employees may not say anything right now. They are noticing, and if things become public, that's going to get brought up. So you can take the legal compliance component, and you can also take the consideration of what is the public impact going to be to the business, and how that'll impact continued client support. Sue, did you have any thoughts on that question? It's a thorny one.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing I would add is just to really focus it on the importance of setting the example of leadership. And as leaders, they have both a moral and a social obligation to demonstrate these behaviors. If that doesn't resonate with them, then I think really the financial of if they're seen as condoning the behavior of not using masks, not using hand sanitizer, they're actually opening themselves up to liability in the event that there was a case in the office or linked back to the office. And even something as simple as fines, but really just the negative view of employees and the impact on morale and employee engagement and culture.
Yeah, so Margot Watson has put in the Q&A just asking for a link to the online symptoms checklist, and I'll put that into the chat once we pass off to Kelsey. One comment that we have from Alex Wright is just an indication that their board was opposed to the idea of social events. There's some pushback from there because of Zoomitis. It's a very fair point. And one of the things to keep in mind is don't do Zoom events then. There's an app that allows you to have everybody sync up and watch a Netflix movie at the same time. Choose a movie that's workplace appropriate and have people connect that way. Take it out of the regular patterns of work, not just in terms of the type of activity, but the way that you're engaging with each other. And this Netflix application is you're chatting with each other by typing out. There's no talking, there's no video conferencing. Get people to engage in a way that's kind of outside the box of what they're expecting, and start to get people more comfortable with those social events by throwing a curveball at them at the start. All right, Kelsey, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Forrest. So I'm here today to talk about compensation because, of course, shifting from office work to virtual work will impact compensation. Employers will want to consider what expenses remote workers should cover and what is reimbursable by the company. So it's important to distinguish between what is considered an incentive and what is accommodation. So by that, I mean what you need to cover versus what contributes to an employee's overall job satisfaction by incentivizing. The CRA 2200 form is a declaration of conditions of employment that's completed by you as the employer to certify that the employee is required to work from home. And there's more info about the specifics of that form on the previous slide on a link. Just there beside the CRA forms. And so again, if you decide to shift to virtual work permanently, you will save, of course, on real estate and equipment fees. So it's recommended that you redirect some of those savings into employees to retain top talent that we know can be hard to find and secure. So going back to that form, the CRA form, it can be used by employees to claim employment expenses that's not reimbursed by the employer on their annual tax return. Employees should make sure to retain the receipts of anything they buy that's necessary to perform their duties remotely. You should also note the square footage of your office area used and the total square footage of your residence, while also keeping track of things like costs such as heating, hydro, and water for your home. The employee can also claim things like supplies and communication tools. So for supplies, it's in a case where the employee has had to provide and pay for these supplies under their employment contract. The supplies are used directly for work and they're not actually reimbursed by the employer. So an example of something like that could be stamps or toner or ink for your printer, Communication tools like cell phones, for example, employees can deduct part of their cell phone expenses on their bill that reasonably relates to employment, but internet bills and the actual hardware of the cost of the cell phones and computers themselves cannot actually be deducted. So next slide, Leanne. So historically for the cell phone plans, the norm has always been for companies, to provide corporately managed IT equipment and give employees, company phones and company computers. But employers may want to actually consider providing a cell phone and technology allowance for employees. So an example of this could be providing, for example, a $50 allowance per month for cell phone bills and say $700 every 3 years to contribute to the purchase of a computer. So the advantage to you as the employer for doing that is that you don't have to manage the phone. It's not actually company property. There isn't any company liability because it's the personal phone. As well, employees get to choose, the model and the make that they want. There isn't really a need to keep business phones and personal phones really separate anymore. If there's a concern about, data security protection, as Forrest mentioned, VPN is a good way to go for that. Looking at your office setup allowance is also something important to look at. So when you're reducing your office footprint, you may want to provide employees with an allowance to purchase their own office furniture. So again, you have that advantage of not really actually owning any company property, but an example could be a one-time taxable allowance of, let's say, $1,000 to help offset the cost of a desk or chair or file cabinet or whatever it is they need. So this would be a one-time purchase, and it's important to keep in mind you don't want to lose an employee that, again, is so often hard to find because they don't feel set up to work from home. And just with my background with kind of health and wellness and kinesiology, I first things first think of the ergonomics. So you want to think about things like improper posture and a bad workstation setup, can cause physical stress, strain, headaches, joint pain, back pain, can even flare up old injuries that people have. So absenteeism as a result of those injuries and aches and pains and whatnot would definitely be more costly in the long run, of course, than just the one-time cost of setting up an employee properly for with a desk and chair. And when I first started at BSG, they brought me over a desk and a chair and a monitor. And not only did it, actually make me more productive just in terms of, output, just by being set up, but, it also made the corner of my bedroom really feel official and like an actual workstation instead of just, a teeny little desk in my room. So I found personally that made a big difference. And lastly, just looking at incentives. So this was sort of touched on a little bit already, but we do consider, or suggest, sorry, I should say that you consider using those savings from office space expenses and anything else that you might save to retain that top talent and really invest in your employees. So some considerations for the future that you might want to consider implementing are things like a wellness credit. So again, back to that overall physical health and wellness, you know, investing in that for employees is paramount. So working from home may cause employees to be more sedentary, you know, without that normal commute or walking to the bus or anything like that. And this sedentary behavior can certainly lead to adverse health and therefore affect productivity at work. So something like a wellness credit towards a gym, a yoga studio, or a virtual workout may help to increase employee health. So an example could be a monthly or yearly reimbursement for those who purchase a membership. And again, if there's that Zoomitis going around, people can consider, you know, workplace wellness plans that encourage people to go out for a walk every day or something like that, just to focus on taking that time away from the screen and getting the body moving a little bit. Employee recognition is important to consider too. So you could look at things, you know, adding perks to ease household responsibility, like grocery delivery, some takeout meals, for example, or household cleaning. Employers will also want to consider investing in personal and professional development, even, you know, for virtual employees. That should continue. So resources like LinkedIn Learning, edX, and Masterclass are good opportunities and can keep employees accountable for their own professional development. So this was discussed again earlier about team building and social support, and I know it's really difficult to kind of make it work for everybody and avoid some of that screen time, but still provide that way of interacting, because, you know, employees who are used to that daily social interaction may find it lonely or isolating to work from home. But even that internal communication system, just to have people chat back and forth, can be helpful to provide that connection. Planning, you know, those regular team building activities, if it's suitable for the organization, can bring people together and help break the ice. So if there's any questions that are specific to this kind of compensation section, I can certainly try and answer them. And then I guess we can move into the more general questions for the whole panel.
But yeah, so again, thanks everyone for joining. We really hope you guys got some good takeaways. The contact information of all the panelists is up on the screen, so if you want to reach out, feel free to go ahead. There's also the contact information just right on our website. You can always reach out to us through there. If you actually look on our website under our Insights COVID resources, there's a lot more kind of useful tools, templates. That's actually where this handbook is housed. And while I'm thinking of it, I'm just gonna post the link one more time in case anyone joined at the end, because you don't see it if you join a bit later.
There's also a draft working from home policy that companies can take and I guess really manipulate for their own needs, but the core information that you would probably want to refer to is already there, and then you can just customize the remaining portions.
Yeah. All right. So I think that's that.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.